All right, so we most recently covered just the horrific nature of World War One in terms of new weapons and the experiences of the soldiers in the trenches. And we've been talking a little bit about how it came to that. Um, Largely, what you have is old strategies going up against new weapons. And the old strategy of hitting the enemy as hard as you can and as fast as you can in a single spot in their line and breaking through or outflanking the other. Those kinds of strategies simply didn't work once the trenches were embedded into the landscape, and especially didn't work because of the machine gun and its ability to really be efficient and effective as a defensive weapon against any ground assault. So they had tried lots of things, the tank, and they had tried blockading one another using Navy or U-boats blockades, using the Air Force, including Zeppelins. I don't think I talked about Zeppelins, but they're basically blimps that they used for bombing attacks. The Germans bombed both London and Paris using Zeppelins. So they're trying everything. And what I want to talk about today is basically what the two sides were trying on the Western Front in the time preceding American involvement. And we might get into why America stayed neutral and why they eventually joined, and then get into some of the important propaganda that took place during World War One tomorrow. But what I want to talk about today is this map here. And you'll notice a couple of spots on the line. One of them I want to draw your attention to. As you can see, the line that was sort of stable through 1915, this brown line. All these lines actually converge at a very important place called Verdun. Now, Verdun becomes one of the biggest battles of World War One. It actually lasts about a year, starting in 1916, and it's interesting as a battle, as a microcosm of World War One, because it gives us a sense of the strategies and overall ideas of the military brass, so to speak. The Germans are going to attack the French town of Verdun. But there's a couple of things about it that are interesting. One, the Germans didn't actually care to capture Verdun. Verdun was not, to them, important to their end goal of winning the war. It didn't open up necessarily any significant advantages if they were able to capture it. Some advantages, maybe, routes for railroads and roads, that sort of thing. But basically, they chose Verdun because they knew it was important to the French. Verdun was very sentimental. It's a place that had been important in the Franco-Prussian wars of the 1800s. Remember, there's lots of pre-existing rivalries in Europe leading up to World War One, and this is one of them. France and Germany were rivals, and Verdun had been sort of a symbol of strength and, defiance during those Franco-Prussian wars, and so there was a sentimentality to Verdun for the French, and the Germans knew that. So the German general von Falkenhayn decided what he wanted to do was attack Verdun because he knew that the French would defend Verdun to the last man. So what he believed would happen is that the French would suffer heavier than normal losses in order to hold on to Verdun. Normally, when you are in military strategy, you are only willing to suffer up to maybe 15% losses before you start to change your strategy, either stop attacking or withdraw from your attack. But the Germans rightfully identified that the French would be really willing to hold on to Verdun, suffer heavier than normal losses before withdrawing, that they would sort of fight to the last man for Verdun. So what the Germans did is they hit Verdun as hard as they could so that they could, in their words, bleed the French white. They wanted the French to suffer so many losses at Verdun that they would have to soften up their lines elsewhere to adjust, bring new troops into Verdun, and eventually lose so many men that they would have to actually surrender from World War One. That was the German goal at Verdun, and it was working. Over about a year, you see really, really heavy losses for the French and for the Germans. Whenever you're the attacking force, you're going to suffer heavy losses. And these losses were just astronomical. Let me show you a few pictures. Here's some trenches. These are French soldiers at Verdun, and you can see the sort of ramshackle way they were having to dig in. They might lose a position and have to really quickly dig a new position to hold on to their ground. This is an aerial picture of a section of Verdun. It gives you a real sense of what happened to the landscape. Look at all those pock marks from the artillery. Look at the trench lines. These are just incredible scars on the European landscape that are still there today. And a lot of that is at places like Verdun along this Hindenburg line. And this is a picture of the memorial at Verdun that gives us a sense of the scope of the battle. Over 1 million casualties. Now, not every casualty is a death, but a casualty is a word that means anybody who couldn't fight the next day. But of course, a lot of those were deaths. And look at the scope of this one single battle. And the French were barely holding on. They were barely holding on. And so they were begging the British to give them some aid. And the way the French and the British were operating is the British basically had the northern part of the line, and the French basically had the southern part of the line, not very much intermingling, not very much at all. So what they did is they said basically to the British, you guys have got to launch an initiative. You guys have got to launch an offensive to relieve the pressure on us here at Verdun. If you attack somewhere else, the Germans will have to divert their attention and some of their men and some of their equipment over there to stop your attack. So they begged the British to accelerate an offensive that they had planned for the summer of 1917. And so what you end up with is a battle called the Somme. The Somme is maybe the most famous battle of World War I. If it's not, Verdun is, and they're 1 and 2 easily. And so the way the Somme began under the British planning is with an extended artillery barrage. You can see here the artillery shells as left over from the Somme. And basically for a full week, 24/7, all they did was pound the German position with artillery. Now their belief was that this would lead the Germans to be, either having to withdraw or there would be nothing left of their positions. What they didn't realize is just how extensive and impressive the German engineering was for their bunkers. If you've gone through sophomore English, you have read All Quiet on the Western Front, and you might have read a little bit about the German engineering. Their bunkers, their underground bunkers, were basically impervious to these artillery attacks. So as the artillery was falling on their heads, they just went down into their bunkers and waited it out. Well, the British general, his name was Haig, basically, he just told his men, hey, listen, after this artillery barrage, you're going to be able to walk across no man's land. There's going to be no resistance. You're going to be able to walk over there and take the German position. And you can notice in this picture here how much equipment the men are carrying. Some of them carrying upwards of 85 pounds of equipment. And they literally were going at a walking pace across no man's land because their expectation was that the Germans would be all dead or having retreated. So they thought, okay, we're just going to walk across no man's land, we're going to take the German position, and that's going to be that. They were completely wrong. In the first day alone, they lost 25,000 men. The Germans were not really impacted by the artillery barrage. They simply came up out of their bunkers, manned their machine gun posts, and mowed the British soldiers down in a row. 25,000 dead in a single day. That's unprecedented in warfare. It's unbelievable. And you know what's even more unbelievable is that the British actually attacked again the next day. They kept going. The Somme lasted something like 6 months. And at an incredibly heavy price, the British were able to gain something like 1 mile or 2 miles of ground, only in a small section of the line. So imagine this. Imagine that the line is a football field. So it's, adding in the end zones and a little bit, it's basically the length of the football field where every foot represents 1 mile. Just imagine it a little bit like that. Then imagine that in about a 10-yard space of the field, the British have attacked as hard as they can. One small section of the football field, 10-yard space. Now imagine that after having lost hundreds of thousands of men, they were able to take one step forward. One. Not even maybe a full step to scale, actually. That's how much progress they made at the Somme. It's a devastating battle, and it looms large in the British memory. The British memory of World War I and Veterans Day, or Armistice Day as they call it, it's a very long memory. It's over 100 years ago, and they still think about it quite constantly, actually, much more than we do. We don't think about World War I nearly as much as they do. One of the things that's maybe sort of tangential to our discussion here, but interesting enough, is that some very, very famous British people were there. You have C.S. Lewis at the Somme and J.R.R. Tolkien. They didn't know each other yet, but they would soon come to know each other. And there's this whole generation of people that really were sort of bonded by the fact that they fought in World War I. They knew how horrific it was. They experienced many of the same things. And Lewis and Tolkien are among them. Both of them counted actually among casualties to a certain degree due to sickness and small wounds. This is a horrific battle, and no progress was made in either direction. The Germans didn't really progress at Verdun. They never captured it. And the British didn't progress at the Somme. And so one of the big questions is, how are they ever going to make progress? And one of the main things that was happening during this time period is the British and the other Western allies, but mostly the British, were recruiting the United States to join. There have been some major changes. The Italians had switched sides at the beginning of the war, and now they were on the side of what we call the Allies, or the Triple Entente. The Ottoman Empire had joined in on the side of the Central Powers. Russia was teetering on the edge at this point, almost ready to drop out. They're going to have a revolution, a communist revolution that's going to lead them to drop out of the war. But in the midst of all that, the British were thinking, man, we need to recruit the United States to join us if we're going to make any progress in this war. So that's what we have to talk about tomorrow. Why is it that why were the Americans neutral? Why did they eventually join? What's the impact of all that? Because as it is, this war of attrition is basically stagnant. There's no movement, and there's just hundreds of thousands and millions of people dying with no progress being made. So let's see if we can sense any kind of breakthrough taking place tomorrow when we do the last video for the week.